I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no peace in this land until slavery is done for. John Brown. On May 9th, 1800, the Brown family had a new baby boy in Torrington, Connecticut. The family lived in a nice-sized wood-framed home. The boy was named John Brown by his father Owen and his mother Ruth. John's father was the son of a Revolutionary War soldier, Captain John Brown. He died in the war in 1776. John was the second born out of his 5 siblings. His father was an abolitionist and moved his family to Hudson, Ohio when John was just 5 years old. Its residents largely supported the anti-slavery movement. His father ran a tannery in Hudson and became rather wealthy. John's mother died shortly after giving birth in 1808. The child and mother both died. Giving birth was a lot more dangerous in those days than it is today. His father married a year or so later to Sally Root. His father helped Hudson, Ohio grow. He was involved in the community and was a civil servant. His father became friends with David Hudson, the founder of Hudson, another abolitionist. The pair were involved in setting up the Underground Railroad in Hudson. Frederick Douglas even stayed in the Browns' home when he came to town. His father became friends with Frederick Douglass. When John Brown was 12 years old, he personally experienced the horrors of slavery firsthand. John was working with a man who had a slave. They were moving cattle. The young African American did something to upset the man. The man beat the boy repeatedly with a shovel right in front of John Brown. From that point forward, his family said that John would do everything in his power to improve the lives of African Americans. At 16, he went to New England for schooling. He returned to Hudson shortly after and worked at his father's tannery. He then started his own tannery a short distance from Hudson with his adopted brother. He met Dianthy Lusk. They were married in 1820. In 1825, the pair moved to Richmond Township, Pennsylvania. There, he started a new tannery and built a cabin and a barn. In the barn, John had built a room to hide slaves who were going along the Underground Railroad. John Brown personally escorted slaves to a waypoint in New York State along the Underground Railroad. He also did survey work, and he had his tannery business. He then became a postmaster. He was doing quite well at this point. John and Dianthy were married for 12 years and had 7 children together. John started having financial trouble after the death of one of his sons. His wife died from complications of childbirth in 1832. Within a year, he was remarried to Mary Ann Day. She was just 17 years old, while John was 33 at the time. This age gap was not unusual for the time. John moved to Franklin Mills, Ohio in 1836 with his new wife. He started a new tannery and bought land using credit in preparation for a canal. When the financial panic of 1837 hit, John suffered a big hit. Creditors foreclosed on his properties. On one occasion, John Brown barricaded himself in a farmhouse that was foreclosed, and he refused to leave. He eventually surrendered. John Brown tried to recover financially. He started another tannery. He sold cattle and sheep, but every business he worked on eventually failed. In 1842, John Brown had to declare bankruptcy. John found his calling in wool. He ran a sheep farm and eventually moved to Springfield, Massachusetts. He got involved in the anti-slavery movement, which was prominent there. He became a member of the abolitionist Sanford Street Free Church. He became friends with Frederick Douglas, who he met after one of his speeches. John Brown also helped runaway slaves along the Underground Railroad in Massachusetts. Gerrit Smith, a wealthy abolitionist and philanthropist, owned 1 million acres of land in the Adirondacks. He decided to try an experiment out. He would divide up 120,000 acres of land, split them up into 40-acre parcels, and give them to free African Americans to live and farm on. In 1849, he gifted John Brown a 40-acre parcel so he could help the black settlers. He named the area Timbuktu due to its remote location. It was a tough undertaking for John and the settlers in the area. The area was undeveloped, so trees needed to be felled, the ground needed to be tilled, and the rocks removed. The weather was also bitterly cold in the Adirondacks. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act passed in Congress. This act required slaves to be returned to their owners, even if they made it into a free state. And the federal government was responsible for finding, returning, and trying any escaped slaves. The South wanted new states open to slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 essentially got rid of the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers the right to vote whether their territory would be a free state or a slave state. In 1855, 5 of John Brown's sons moved to the Kansas Territory: John Jr., Jason, Owen, Frederick, and Solomon. They hoped to make a difference with their voting in making Kansas a free state. The events that followed would put John Brown's name on the map. Pro-slavery forces poured into Kansas, mostly from neighboring Missouri. They were known as the Border Ruffians. Polling places were seized, and a pro-slavery legislature was set up. John Brown Jr. wrote his father asking him to come to Kansas and to bring arms, that it was time for the anti-slavery movement to fight. John Brown, 55, arrived in Kansas with weapons and ammunitions he could gather. He gained support to fight the anti-slavery settlers. The sacking of Lawrence was a pro-slavery success. They rode into Lawrence and destroyed anti-slavery newspapers and prominent buildings in the town. The anti-slavery settlers in Lawrence did not put up a fight. Only one person died in the attack. It was actually a pro-slavery man who died from a piece of falling rubble when the Free State Hotel was destroyed. Senator Charles Sumner made a speech in Congress denouncing the crimes in Kansas and the Southern leaders who were complicit. He mentioned Senator Andrew Butler, Representative Preston Brooks's first cousin. One day after the sacking of Lawrence, Preston Brooks confronted Sumner about the speech. When Sumner went to stand up from his desk, Preston hit him over the head with his cane multiple times. Sumner eventually got away and then fell unconscious. He was nearly beat to death. This was the worst violence ever seen on the floor of Congress. News of this, along with the sacking of Lawrence, enraged John Brown. The night of May 24th and the early morning of the 25th, John Brown, along with his sons and some anti-slavery settlers, brutally murdered 5 pro-slavery militants. He had specifically targeted the men. They were beaten horribly, then had limbs removed, and were even beaten to death. This would be known as the Potawatomi Massacre. It was cold-blooded murder. This event sparked the period known as Bleeding Kansas. John Jr. and Jason, 2 of John Brown's sons, were captured, even though they did not take part in the massacre. John was almost beaten to death during the capture. John Brown, along with some of his followers and members of the town of Palmyra, thwarted an attack from anti-slavery militants and then captured them. John Brown, along with over 30 of his men, tried to fight off an attack at Osawatomie, but the town was burned to the ground. His son, Frederick, died in the conflict. John Brown and his men fled into the woods on the outskirts of the town and avoided capture. The violence then stopped, at least for a time, when the new governor of Kansas, John Geary, ordered both sides to disband and offered clemency to them. John Brown had become infamous after these events in Kansas and even had warrants for his arrest. He now had to be careful when and where he traveled. John Brown had been planning something big for years. He traveled across New England, meeting with abolitionists and prominent people to obtain funds and guns. John Brown was planning a raid at the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and then arm slaves in the area for his war against slavery. Word came that Brown was to be arrested in Boston. He hid in the home of Judge Thomas Russell. Here he met William Lloyd Garrison. Most of the money that John Brown received was from the men known as the Secret Six: Franklin B. Sanborn, Samuel Howe, George L. Stearns, Gerrit Smith, Theodore Parker, and Thomas Wentworth Higson. John Brown had weapons sent to the Kennedy farmhouse in Sharpsburg, Maryland, a relatively short distance from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The weapons were stored here. John Brown met Harriet Tubman in Ontario. When Harriet saw John, she believed she had seen him before in a dream. It's believed that she helped John Brown with some of the planning for his raid with her knowledge of the area. It's said that she was to attend the raid but fell ill and could not go. He returned to Kansas, where he was involved in raids into Missouri. He also liberated slaves and captured supplies. He escorted the slaves to Detroit, and then they made their way freed into Canada. A bounty was put on John Brown for his capture from the Missouri governor. John Brown met with Frederick Douglas again and tried to convince him to join on his raid onto Harper's Ferry. Frederick Douglass refused to get involved in the raid. John Brown's followers from Kansas met in Iowa in preparation for the raid. Jeremiah Goldsmith Anderson, Oliver Brown, Owen Brown, John E. Cook, Albert Hazlitt, John Henry Kagi, William H. Lehman, Aaron Dwight Stevens, Charles Plummer Tidd. He also recruited Watson Brown, John Copeland Jr., Barclay Coppock, Edwin Coppock, Shields Green, Lewis Leary, Francis Merriam, Dangerfield Newberry, Stuart Taylor, Dolphine Thompson, William Thompson. The men stayed at the Kennedy farmhouse for a few months leading up to the raid. October 16, 1859, John Brown started his raid on Harper's Ferry. They entered the town without a fight. They then cut the telegraph lines. They captured the armory. Only one man was guarding it. He quickly surrendered. A train came into town. A baggage master ran away to warn the conductor. He was ordered by John Brown to stop. He did not, and he was shot dead. He was a free black man, the first death of the raid. John Brown allowed the train to leave. The train arrived at the next station. It telegraphed news of the raid. Word spread quickly. John Brown's raiders captured hostages from the area. Most importantly, George Washington's great-grandnephew, Colonel Lewis Washington. President Washington's saber was even taken by Brown. The next day, an angry mob of townsfolk fired down on Brown's men from the heights of the town. No slaves rushed to Brown and his men. Militiamen came into Harper's Ferry and blocked off their escape route. At this point, 8 of his men were dead, and 2 of his men had escaped. The rest of his men barricaded themselves in the engine house, later known as John Brown's Fort. The morning of the 18th, Colonel Robert E. Lee, in command of a company of Marines, surrounded the engine house. Lieutenant Jeb Stuart approached with a white flag and offered the traitors their lives if they surrendered. John Brown refused and said, "No, I prefer to die here." The Marines approached the engine house with battering rams and sledgehammers. They forced their way in. John Brown was beat down and wounded. The raid was now over. No slaves from the surrounding area would come to join his army and fight the war against slavery. John Brown was questioned by authorities. Brown, Copeland, Coppock, Green, and Stevens were charged with murder, inciting a slave insurrection, and treason. The men were tried in Charleston in a week-long trial. The jury deliberated for just 45 minutes and found John Brown guilty on all 3 counts. He was then sentenced to be hanged. It was the first public trial. The telegraph allowed for quick communication between reporters and their newspapers. After he was found guilty, John Brown was allowed to talk with reporters. He answered questions for hours. The newspapers went wild. There were plans to rescue Brown, but Brown did not want to be rescued. He knew how important his death would be to the anti-slavery movement. John Brown was allowed to see his wife before his death. John Brown's last written words to his jailer were, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." John Brown was transported in a wagon with his coffin from the jail to the gallows. A crowd of 2,000 people were present, along with the infamous John Wilkes Booth, President Abraham Lincoln's assassin. He borrowed a militia uniform so that he could see the hanging. Stonewall Jackson was also present. At 11:15, John Brown was hanged. After 35 minutes, he was pronounced dead. His body was put in the coffin and transported to his home in North Elba, New York. John Brown's raid had a part in the start of the American Civil War, which inevitably ended slavery. So in the end, John Brown did have a part in ending slavery, though not entirely. John Brown became a hero in the North by many people during the war, and a terrorist and murderer to the people in the South. John Brown was an extremist and a murderer in every way, from his murders in Kansas to his raid in Harper's Ferry. In the end, he wanted to give his life in exchange for a better life for African Americans. I want to thank y'all for watching this, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.